You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
Ironically, men of science relied on women's grassroots knowledge. European governments sent them to the Americas to bioprospect for pharmaceuticals, even as these men simultaneously dismissed women's knowledge in their writings.
Hello, and welcome to episode 379 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Women make up a majority of healthcare workers in the United States, where they represent 8 in 10 healthcare workers. Whereas within the overall workforce of the United States, which represents all jobs in the workforce, women consist of just about 50% of workers. Yet, when we look at the jobs that women perform in healthcare, they still lag behind men when it comes to fulfilling the roles of medical doctors and surgeons. Susan Brandt, a historian and lecturer at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, seeks to better understand why women make up a majority of workers in the healthcare fields, but a minority of medical doctors and surgeons. So she joins us to investigate the very rich history of women healers in the early American period, with details from her book, Women Healers: Gender, Authority, and Medicine in Early Philadelphia. Now, as we investigate women healers, Susan reveals information about the roles women performed as healers during the early modern period, how women created and passed down medical knowledge from one culture and one generation to the next, and why and how women's roles as healers and medical practitioners became obscured and even erased from our collective historical memory. But first, I have to admit that women healers is a topic that's close to my heart. My mom is a registered nurse, and she has always taken care of the healthcare needs and questions of everyone in my family, and even for my friends, their families, and our neighbors. When a friend fell ill, their mom would often call my mom, and then my mom would get in her car and make a house call to their house and diagnose and recommend a treatment for my friend's ailment. And when my brother and I or one of her grandchildren fall ill today, my mom is still reaching out to find out how we're feeling and to see if she needs to recommend a trip to the doctor or some other medical remedy. In my experience, women healers tend to work tirelessly and often behind the scenes. They still function in many of the same ways that we're about to explore with Susan. So I'd like to dedicate this episode and this conversation to my mom and to all the other women healers who keep us healthy, nurse us when we're ill, and make our healthcare systems work. Their work is hard and often unseen, but I see you, women healers, and after today's episode, more of us will see you too. Thank you so much for all the work you do. Okay, are you ready to explore the fascinating world and work of early American women healers? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is a historian and former nurse practitioner. She's a lecturer at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and her research focuses on women and gender and the history of medicine and health in early America. She's also the author of the book, Women Healers: Gender, Authority, and Medicine in Early Philadelphia. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Susan Brandt.
Thank you. I really love this podcast, so I'm very excited to have the opportunity to participate.
Well, thank you for listening. And we're really excited to have you too, because Women Healers is a really fascinating book. It investigates early American women who provided various kinds of medical care in the greater Philadelphia area during the early American period. Now, Susan, your research into early Philadelphia's women healers spans a pretty long time period for a history book. So I wonder if we could start with having you tell us about the time period of your research and why you chose to study women healers in a city like Philadelphia and not, say, in a city like early New York or Charleston.
Yes, the time frame for my book spans from the late 17th century through the early 19th century, but the bulk of the story coincides with Ben Franklin's long life from 1706 to 1790. So in the book, we literally enter Ben Franklin's world of women healers. And I chose this periodization because I was charting the change over time in women's healthcare practices. Surprisingly, the lives and work of early North American female practitioners have gone largely unexplored by historians of early America, apart from a few great studies like Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's A Midwife's Tale, that classic, and Rebecca Tannenbaum's The Healer's Calling. But despite the relative lack of data, some standard medical histories depict women as amateurs whose influence declined over the course of the 18th century. And that was kind of the narrative I was interested in understanding and complicating. And after digging in over 30 archives and historical societies in the US and the UK, I discovered that Euro-American, African-American, and Indigenous women were essential medical providers in the greater Philadelphia area. And I argue that women were not inflexible traditional practitioners destined to fall victim to the onward march of Enlightenment science, capitalism, and medical professionalization. Instead, women of various classes and ethnicities found new sources of healing authority, engaged in the consumer medical marketplace, and resisted physicians' attempts to marginalize them. And women healers participated actively in medical and scientific knowledge production and the transition to market capitalism. And these were surprises in my research. So why Philadelphia? Besides the fact that it's Ben Franklin's world, by the mid-18th century, Philadelphia was the premier British colonial city in commerce, science, and medicine. And it was home to the colony's first hospital, medical school, lending library, and philosophical society. And of course, Ben Franklin was the city's quintessential gentleman of science and founder of civic institutions. Women, like Ben Franklin's friend, the healer and merchant Elizabeth Coates Pascal, participated in these organizations. For example, Pascal and her mother were part of an organization that contributed funds to the Pennsylvania Hospital's pharmacy. And the hospital was a charitable institution for the sick poor founded by Franklin and Thomas Bond in 1751. Pascal also checked out medical and scientific books from Franklin's library company that informed her medical practice. Even more so, Philadelphia had a diverse population for the time. There were voluntary and coerced immigrants from the British Isles, Africa, the Caribbean, Nordic countries, the German states, and other European countries. And these immigrants encountered, of course, resident indigenous peoples that they, exchanged healing information. And healthcare practitioners of various ethnicities and religious persuasions contributed a really vast array of health practices and differing medical worldviews to the healing environment. And this created novel hybrid healing cultures in early Pennsylvania. And of course, Philadelphia was founded by the Quaker William Penn, and Quakerism's emphasis on equality, simplicity, peace, and integrity also informed women's medical practices.
So it sounds like women healers really functioned as doctors in early America, but it also sounds like they may have worked very differently from how we would think of doctors working today. So would you help us define what we mean when we say women healers?
Yes, this was, again, kind of one of the surprises of my research, just the actual extent of women's practices. They did similar practices to physicians. They worked as doctresses, as apothecaries, as bone setters, actually setting, broken bones, cancer specialists, midwives, eye specialists, herbalists, and nurses, to name a few. And at times they both collaborated and competed with male physicians. And again, I was sort of surprised at their participation in an emerging capitalist marketplace by preparing and selling popular patent medicines and by peddling pharmaceuticals door to door. And importantly, this was a really freewheeling medical marketplace with few legal constrictions and different from ours in the 21st century, where we place healthcare workers in rigid categories regulated by state licensure. And the lack of regulation allowed for expanded roles. I mean, anyone could declare themselves a doctor, doctoress, or apothecary, but it was a let the buyer beware environment without any guarantees of providers' credentials or the safety or efficacy of therapeutics. So over the course of my research, I really broadened my idea of women healers. At first, I thought I would, just find little grannies giving herbal cures. But I construe healing in its broadest sense that encompasses a spectrum of paid and unpaid healing work diagnostic, prescriptive, therapeutic, pharmaceutical, obstetric, and nursing services. And women's healing practices could incorporate any combination of these, often changing over a course of a lifetime. And they really practiced within the same medical worldview as educated and physicians, deploying what was understood the standard medical care of the time, humoral medical theories, chemical principles that involved balancing certain essences in the body. So women did invasive procedures like bloodletting, where you would take blood out of the body to balance the bad humors, or emetics to cause vomiting. And, these theories are complicated and beyond the scope of the podcast. But as we're thinking about women healers, we need to remember that ideas about medicine and science in early America are quite different from our own today. And then, of course, Indigenous and Black communities had their own medical worldviews. So women are practicing, very similarly to physicians. One thing they do less of is surgery. They might do minor surgery, but things like amputations or the removal of kidney stones was a popular surgery, or removal of tumors, all of which at the time before anesthesia or antibiotics were quite risky. So they had a similar primary practice that I might have recognized as a nurse practitioner.
That's fascinating that anybody who essentially wanted to participate as a healthcare provider in early America could have done so because, as you said, there was so little regulation. And I have to believe that a lack of regulation in this buyer beware market of healthcare in early America also meant that you need to have a great amount of trust with your patients if you wanted to work as a healthcare provider, if you wanted to work as one of these women healers. Then people in your community, the people you treated, would really have to trust you.
Yes, and this is kind of an important discourse at this time, especially as we move into this consumer medical marketplace. The real question was, whom can you trust? And medical anthropologists look at something called a hierarchy of resort, or the sequence or criteria that patients use when seeking a particular practitioner or therapy. And, it's kind of tempting to think that people might try self-care, move to a woman healer, and then maybe move to a doctor, or perhaps what we might consider a higher level of care. In practice, in women's recipe books and in their writings and letters, I see people just kind of moving around the health spectrum. They might go consult a physician. That doesn't affect the cure. They go to a woman healer. They might go to a Native American specialist or a woman who's a cancer specialist. So just kind of almost the way people today might, if you have back pain, you might go to a chiropractor or a neurologist or acupuncturist. So again, the trust was really the factor. Who seems to provide the cures? And at the time, even in people's writings, there's a sneaky suspicion that no one has a magic bullet, that everyone is just trying to find a cure and find a trustworthy practitioner.
When we've talked to scholars about women in early America, many historians seem to study women in Philadelphia, and they seem to do so because Quakerism provided for, or perhaps allowed for, expanded roles for women compared to other religious traditions in other colonies. Susan, would you speak to this and tell us a little bit more about Quakerism and the ways that Quakerism might have allowed for expanded medical roles for women?
Right. And as I said, there were these Quaker testimonies of peace, equality, integrity, and the Quakers really did try to flesh these out. And William Penn and his wife, Gulielma Springett Penn, who was herself a skilled healer, helped to establish a radical sect called the Society of Friends in England. And Friends, also called Quakers, challenged social, gender, and political hierarchies. Their assertions of equality prompted them to reject norms of social deference. They kind of classically declined to doff their hats to their reputed social betters. Think of the Quaker Oats guy with that big black hat on the Quaker Oats box. And they also refused to swear loyalty oaths to the crown or pay taxes to support wars, which of course got them in trouble with the British government. Their emphasis on spiritual equality allowed Quaker women to enter the public sphere in roles as ministers and healers. And women friends challenged gender hierarchies by speaking in Quaker religious meetings and preaching to what they called promiscuous audiences of men and women. And women ministers often traveled without their husbands or children throughout England and the Atlantic world, preaching to Quakers and non-Quakers. And of course, this behavior was far outside the norms for English women, who, according to biblical precepts, should remain silent in church, avoid public roles, and never, what the Bible says, usurp authority over the man. And the emphasis on literacy gave Quaker women access to printed medical and scientific texts that they would apply to their healing work. Quakers also rejected professional hierarchies, which allowed lay healers to challenge learned physicians' authority. And Quakers' subversive norms informed the way that gender operated in early Philadelphia, even after Quakers' population dwindled.
Since you've brought up Gulielma Penn, when you wrote about Penn and women healers, you referred to her as Lady Bountiful, given the role that she played in her English community. Would you tell us why you refer to Penn as a Lady Bountiful, what a Lady Bountiful is, and perhaps tell us even more about Penn's work in her English community?
I do see the term Lady Bountiful in women's writings applied to elite women healers. And this image was actually reified in George Farquhar's popular restoration comedy called The Beau Stratagem that was introduced to Philadelphia audiences in 1749. According to Farquhar, Lady Bountiful was an old civil country gentlewoman that cures all her neighbors of all diseases. And the local tavern keeper quipped, "She's cured more people in and about Litchfield in 10 years than the doctors have killed in 20. So you can see this is sort of a stereotypical character, but she's also that person that we see in a comedy that everyone knows a Lady Bountiful. Everyone knows this elite woman healer in their communities. And she does represent women in England and its colonies who provided healthcare for their families, servants, dependents, and tenants. And Gulielma Penn managed the family's estates when her husband was absent on preaching tours, or he was often actually in prison for his beliefs. And this gave Gulielma opportunities to enact the role of Lady Bountiful by visiting the sick, providing free health care, and offering provisions to her tenants and dependent poor, which of course bolstered her social capital. And then tenants in this sort of moral economy would reciprocate with rent payments and displaying deference to their alleged social betters. And interestingly, only a few of Gulielma Penn's letters survive, but she kept a medical recipe book that maps what one contemporary called her great skill in physic. This was the older term for medicine and surgery. And she practiced, back to that question of what were women doing, she practiced what we would recognize as medicine, surgery, ophthalmology, pharmacy, and nursing. And Penn's manuscript was passed down from her grandmother, another Lady Bountiful, Catherine Partridge Springett, who, according to one account, saw like 20 patients in a morning and cared for long-term invalids at no charge. She was also an eye specialist who recorded over 30 eye remedies in the recipe book. She was so proficient in cataract surgery that, according to one source, Stevens, the great oculist, sent many to her house when there was difficulty of a cure. And it was actually not unusual for women to become ocular experts who what they called couched cataracts using a needle to displace the cloudy lens. This actually required the same fine motor skills that women developed with decorative needlework. So this is one instance where women did indeed do surgery. Again, elite women, Ladies Bountiful like Penn and Springett, often collaborated with physicians like the oculist, or other doctors might need these gentry women as sources for patient referrals. But women's books often record the phrase cured when the doctors failed. So they were also comfortable countering physicians' therapies. You know, it's interesting that Gulielma Penn never came to Pennsylvania, but her son brought her medical manuscript to the colony. And I sort of feel that it embodies the written and oral transmission of a foundational culture of authoritative women healers from Britain to North America. I guess one other comment, though, here is that it's important to recognize Lady Bountiful's literary antithesis, which was the stereotype image of the wise woman healer that people derisively called old wives or cunning women. We hear this word old wives' tales. And their remedies might indeed include occult charms or potions. But these also were actual women. They were from the lower social orders who provided healing in their communities. But unlike wealthy, bountiful healers, old wives charged or bartered for their services. And this placed them in direct economic competition with male physicians and apothecaries, this older word for pharmacists. And not surprisingly, doctors scorned these wise women healers. But along with Lady Bountiful, lay women healers provided the bulk of healthcare in their communities. And when we ignore women healers, we disregard the many patients who couldn't afford physicians' fees.
I wonder if we could dig a bit deeper into the medical recipe books you just mentioned, because today, when you say a recipe book, people think of ingredients for food dishes and the process by which you prepare a new meal. But you're talking about a medical recipe book, which was something that Guglielmo Penn and her associates kept during the late 17th and possibly even early 18th centuries. So would you tell us about medical recipe books, what they look like, and about the different information and recipes they contain?
Sure. And this is an important source of information. Literate women often kept household manuscript books that might include cooking, medical, and household recipes. And recipe books were collective enterprises. Women healers would share recipes with each other and with male lay healers, physicians, pharmacists, and others. And they modified remedies based on their patient encounters and experiments. Many recipe books offer only a straightforward record of ingredients, their preparation, and sometimes prescriptions for its use. But scholars have recently recognized household recipe books as rich repositories that document things like women's literacy, authorship, medical knowledge production, and engagement with early modern science. And the Penn manuscript exemplifies hundreds of recipe books extant in archives in the US and UK, but they really represent only a fraction of what was produced. Unfortunately, most archives considered household manuscripts mere women's trivia and rarely acquired them. So many have been lost, either thrown away by descendants. You might go up into the attic and find a moldy recipe book and out it goes, or again, not kept by archives. And it underscores the difficulty of recovering even literate women's healing practices, and this was a challenge throughout my research. Most healers didn't leave behind any written records, but fortunately some manuscripts written by elite women provide glimpses into the vibrant oral cultures of non-literate women healers. When I give a book talk face-to-face, I usually show attendees actual recipe books or PowerPoint images, and instead, I'd like to read a short excerpt from Elizabeth Pascal's recipe book so that listeners can get a sense of these manuscripts. As I said, Pascal was a merchant and healer in Philadelphia, and the excerpt I'll read to you is just one of over 150 entries in Pascal's book that, along with a business account book and her will, are the only records that she left behind. Fortunately, Pascal's book is particularly detailed. She includes her patients' symptoms and outcomes, as well as the webs of medical and scientific information exchanges that imbued her remedies with multiple layers of authority. And this is a full-page entry. I'm just going to read a part of it. It's titled, For a Consumption. And this is what we would recognize today as tuberculosis, lung cancer, or another wasting pulmonary illness. Here's the recipe. Take blackberry briar roots, the upright sort, not the creeping dewberry, and sassafras roots, and white beech bark, each half a bushel, and boil it for 4 to 5 hours in a sufficient quantity of spring water till it's reduced to 10 gallons. Put in a gallon of molasses and brew it up with yeast and let it work and then bottle it. My friend Nathaniel Thomas perfectly cured a man who was brought so low as to keep to his bed. I also gave a recipe to a Jersey Indian man of about 50 years who was in a consumption. While I was dosing him to it, a woman that was well-dressed and seemed like a person of credit commended this highly and said that a young woman in her neighborhood was cured of a consumption by this same drink when she'd been given over as past recovery. In a few months, the son came looking for me at my house and gave me thanks for what I had done for his father, who was cured in a month. So this gives you a sense of these webs of medical information sharing. The Jersey Indian man was likely a Lenape man. They're sometimes called Delawares, the original residents of the Delaware Valley. At this time, he was likely from the Brotherton Reservation in New Jersey. Ironically, Pascal used standard indigenous botanicals, North American blackberry and sassafras, combined with English molasses to treat the Lenape man. And here we see a man consulting a healer outside of his community, but Pennsylvania settlers also often consulted indigenous healers. It also suggests that Pascal saw patients in her dry goods shop, which would have been on the first floor of her home on Market Street. Another recipe for, quote, a most racking torture in every joint from head to foot and in the bowels gives us a real sense of the rigors of shopkeeping combined with the medical practice, because she said it was caused by a chill from standing too long in the shop without having my meals in due time. Other recipes give information about her inventive remedies, such as an excellent salve for a burn, my own invention. She also demonstrates confidence in old wife or elder women healers that she often found more valuable than those of physicians. In one instance, she described a sufferer who was cured of a cancer on her face by an old woman using celandine and may butter after the patient had spent some scores of pounds on a doctor. So she seeks the elder woman healer. Another elder woman cured a cancer that had eaten away great parts of a man's lips. So again, we see women providing a variety of care, including being cancer specialists.
I know we'd love to know more about the cross-cultural exchange of medical advice. But first, how did these early American women learn about all of these different cures that they were writing down in their recipe books? You mentioned that one cure you read about had information about the healing properties of plants and herbs that you could find in English and North American gardens. So how did early American women healers learn about these healing properties?
Right. And of course, there were no women's medical schools until the mid-19th century. And as you might imagine, women in family and kin networks passed down knowledge and provided hands-on training. And this was true for white women, African American women, and indigenous women as well. Some women were, like a healer named Margaret Hill Morris, were part of medical families with male kin who were physicians and women kin who were recognized healers. So this was a family enterprise. Women apothecaries, again, the older word for pharmacists, learned skills from male kin and sometimes took over the pharmacy practice after the death of a husband or father. Some women were also part of local, intercolonial, and transatlantic networks of natural philosophers. Those are the scientists of the day. Men like Benjamin Franklin and Elizabeth Pascal did participate in these networks. And literate women like Gulielma Penn, Elizabeth Pascal, and her cousin Margaret Morris read and transcribed sections from popular medical works, published herbals, and medical texts on botany, chemistry, and anatomy. And of course, this is at a moment when most 18th century Enlightenment philosophers maintained that reason and logic were white male attributes. They argued that white women and people of color were innately illogical, passionately emotional, and unfit for what they considered the rational enterprises of medicine and science. Ironically, men of science relied on women's grassroots knowledge. European governments sent them to the Americas to bioprospect for pharmaceuticals, even as these men simultaneously dismissed women's knowledge in their writings. Until recently, this discourse has been mirrored in the marginalization of women in histories of science and medicine. This is one of the reasons that we don't know a lot about women healers, because there's been a historical amnesia around them. I can give you an example of Elizabeth Pascal using Franklin's Library Company for her self-education, just so you have a sense of the extent of women's engagement with science. One subject deemed inappropriate for women was anatomy, which was becoming the most important marker of a learned physician. But this didn't deter women like Pascal. In her manuscript, she advises readers to look in Dr. James's Medicinal Dictionary, which is an imposing 3-volume folio set, each volume almost 1,200 pages, that she tells us she checked out of the library. And because the Library Company has been in continuous operation, 21st century scholars can follow in Pascal's reading footsteps. During my fellowship at the Library Company, as the librarian wheeled these out in a cart, I imagine Pascal hefting these 15-pound folios onto the reading room desk, maybe discussing them with patrons, or walking with them in her arms going down Market Street. Hey, Liz, what have you got? Oh, Dr. James. Or maybe putting them on the table on her dry goods shop and discussing them with patients. After plowing through 15 densely written folio pages describing an anatomical dissection at London's Royal Academy, this is the premier scientific academy, presented by the preeminent anatomist Dr. James Douglas, Pascal transcribed in her manuscript key points of the dissection of a woman with an enlarged thyroid gland. But significantly, and this I just found really fascinating, Pascal also copied a section that lauded not university-educated physicians, but rather an Englishwoman healer who cured patients' tumors without exposing them to risky surgery. So as she's copying this passage, Pascal extended her medical networks to include an Englishwoman in the virtual world of print. Pascal foregrounded the contributions of a woman healer like herself, who might otherwise be erased in scholarly writings. She constructed a more inclusive narrative of authoritative women in medicine and science, and we see her writing herself into the story.
Susan, you mentioned earlier that sometimes Indigenous people went to Euro-American healers, and sometimes Euro-Americans went to Indigenous or African and African-American healers. We need to take a brief moment to thank our episode's sponsor, but when we get back, we'd really like to investigate these cases that you came across of cross-cultural exchanges of medicine and medical knowledge. Friends, I need your help. Whether this is your first time listening to Ben Franklin's World or your 379th time, I need you to take our listener survey. The Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios team and I want to hear from you. We want to know what you like about the show, what you dislike, and what you'd like to see added or changed. We produce this podcast for you, and we need you to tell us how we can do that better. Please take our listener survey and help us get to know you as a person and Ben Franklin's World listener. Let us know your thoughts about the show. You'll find this survey at benfranklinsworld.com/survey. That's benfranklinsworld.com/survey. In fact, if you're listening on an internet-connected computer, tablet, or smartphone, go ahead and press pause right now and take the survey at benfranklinsworld.com/survey. It's okay, press pause. I'll hold our conversation with Susan until you're done. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking our listener survey. And now, let's get back to our conversation with Susan. Susan, we know from our conversations with historians in episode 301 that Onesimus, a man enslaved by Cotton Mather, brought knowledge of a way to counter smallpox through inoculation from his experiences in Africa. So different peoples really did have their own medical and healing traditions. And I wonder if you could tell us about the cross-cultural sharing of these traditions and knowledge among the different peoples who lived in early North America and, as you said, composed a pretty diverse population in early Philadelphia.
Absolutely. And I think that the smallpox epidemic in Boston really gives an excellent example how the enslaved man Onesimus provides critical medical knowledge that creates controversy, but also opens the way for the adoption of inoculation. One thing important to understand is it's very difficult to get at these healing cultures because these are oral healing cultures. But we do know that Indigenous women were recognized by settlers as experts at healing wounds, fractures, and infections. And in history of medicine, you try to enter into the historical moment and not kind of look back too much. But researchers have found that many of the medicines that Native peoples were using actually were bactericidal. They would actually cleanse the wound rather than just throwing a poultice on it. So there is some sense that they really were experts at these processes. And of course, as I mentioned, European men of science as well as women healers were quite interested in their medical knowledge. One example that I found was a woman named Hannah Freeman. She was a Lenape or Delaware healer who lived west of Philadelphia. And she exemplifies Indigenous practitioners who garnered healing authority based on their knowledge of local botanicals and their reputations for successful cures that, of course, were valued within their own communities as well as among Pennsylvania's settlers. By selling herbs, healing advice, and baskets, along with paid domestic work, Freeman earned the income that allowed her to spend the majority of her life in the places of her Lenape ancestors. Despite the dislocations and violence caused by European colonizations, the Lenapes were being displaced from their lands. So the healing was kind of a strategy of persistence for this woman. And sometimes we can find information in European-produced sources that we must read very carefully. And in his writings, the Moravian missionary, John Helkwelder, praised Native American women's healing skills. And he noted with obvious approval, their science is entirely founded on observation, experience, and the well-tried effectiveness of remedies. Very striking that he identified Indigenous women healers as physicians, presumably a mark of respect, and considered their knowledge as science that he would recognize as European science. But of course, they were practicing within their own ways of knowing about the natural world and its healing applications as they had for centuries. Unfortunately, over time, as these botanicals became standard European pharmaceuticals, physicians and scientists erased their indigenous origins. But of course, indigenous healers and their practices persist into the present. In terms of African American healers, Black women retained African healing knowledge and practices despite the brutal forced migrations of the Atlantic slave trade. Sufferers valued African American women healers' abilities to cure snakebite, poisoning, and smallpox. A freedwoman named Anna Bellamy, who specialized in bone setting, dentistry, and wound care in mid-18th century Philadelphia, was described as a woman of education and the Black doctor. Elizabeth Pascal recorded an elderly Black healer's successful cure for a putrefied joint that prevented an amputation in a Pennsylvania settler. So women of color were frontline healthcare workers from Pennsylvania's early days.
Would you tell us more about the rich tradition of African American women healers in Philadelphia? Because it seemed like, in addition to being important frontline healthcare workers for everyday occurrences, they also seem to have played a very important role in the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, which was a period when anyone who could afford to leave Philadelphia so that they wouldn't get sick did leave the city. And yet many Black women stayed behind and assisted with the epidemic, even when they could afford to leave.
Yes. And again, I point to the difficulty of recovering the practices of Black women healers. And this is a moment where suddenly they emerge into the spotlight, not only in Philadelphia, but their practice and their work is visible for historians. And the 1793 yellow fever epidemic was really quite devastating. It killed 10% of Philadelphia's resident population, leaving the city in disarray. And of course, in the post-COVID era, we're very sympathetic to just how terrible this can be. Wealthy people fled the city, and those left behind hid in their homes and ignored the plight of their dying neighbors. So skilled healers were in demand, but very scarce. So Black nurses like Sarah Bass, under the auspices of a Black organization called the Free African Society, took this opportunity to assert their healing authority as humanitarian activist healers to validate African Americans' worthiness for civil equality. And they risked their lives to provide frontline 24-hour nursing care for white Philadelphians whom sources describe as vomiting blood, raging with madness, and having strong convulsions. And as a nurse myself, as I read about treating a yellow fever patient, this was really a tough nursing duty. And instead of offering accolades for this benevolent service, a prominent publisher, Matthew Carey, accused Black nurses of theft and profiteering in his best-selling pamphlet on the epidemic. It was at the Free African Society nurses' insistence that their ministers, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, published one of the first Black protest pamphlets to vindicate their service. And not all Philadelphians agreed with Carey. The nurses' self-sacrificing civic service was lauded by Philadelphia's mayor, by the prominent physician Benjamin Rush, and others, and there was even a poem written in their honor. And importantly, to sacrifice oneself for the Republic was the essence of citizenship in the classical political thought of that time. So they were essentially enacting citizenship in their self-sacrificing work. Sarah Bass is herself an interesting person. She began her life enslaved in Isle of Wight County, Virginia, not too far from Williamsburg. She obtained her freedom in Philadelphia, served in the yellow fever epidemic, married Reverend Richard Allen, and became the founding mother of the AME, or the African Methodist Episcopal Church, that continues to be a vibrant and socially activist denomination.
As you can probably tell, Susan's book, Women Healers, provides vignettes of early American women healers like Sarah Bass, Elizabeth Pascal, and other women who were well respected as healers within their communities. Susan, many historians, at least those that I have read, have written that by the 19th century, the medical field had professionalized. These historians state that men like Dr. Benjamin Rush and others who had had access to formal medical education used their authority as formally educated physicians to push women like Elizabeth Pascal out of the medical field. I wonder if you would tell us why historians believe this happened and how you, through your research, argue that this was not really the case for women healers, at least within the greater Philadelphia area.
It kind of reflects an older trend in the history of medicine. There was sort of this history of male physicians triumphing over superstition. But when you really drill into the historic moment, it's easier to understand what authority physicians wielded and also their limits. Doctors with formal medical training certainly developed prestige in their communities. They served in the yellow fever epidemic. Many, like Benjamin Rush, also became politicians and also were part of a public health movement. But importantly, there were no regulatory licensure structures that allowed doctors to push a lay healer or male lay practitioner out of practice. Also, physicians in the city of brotherly love had been fractured since the founding of Pennsylvania's first medical school in 1765. Erstwhile friends and colleagues, Dr. John Morgan and William Shippen, had battled over the prestige of being considered the medical school's founding physician. And their simmering conflict erupted again in a scathing pamphlet war in 1777 amid the American Revolution. Here doctors are battling amid wartime. During the 1793 yellow fever epidemic, the medical community fractured again over causes and treatments of the fever. And you see complaints in the newspaper. The people of Philadelphia are asking doctors to stop arguing with each other and figure out how to treat the disease. And you kind of feel like, guys, this is not how you do medical hegemony. So particularly the Philadelphia medical community had difficulty consolidating. Importantly, healthcare at the time was delivered in the home and women's domestic sphere. So doctors had to mind their bedside manners, especially with elite white women healers who were important sources of physician referrals. Also, as anatomical dissections became part of doctors' trainings, communities were up in arms when a medical school opened. They rightly feared that medical students would be robbing graves. And this is a whole other conversation, but that did, in fact, happen. In the early 19th century, physicians faced additional challenges from alternative medical movements like homeopathy, hydropathy, also called water cure, Thomsonian botanicalism, and many more. So doctors just had their hands too full to worry about laywomen healers. But I think that newer histories of medicine do recognize that it's really the mid to late 19th century that doctors began organizing themselves. We begin to see the American Medical Association. And it's really the early 20th century when healthcare moved into hospitals that physicians consolidated the power and authority that we think of today. In my book, I discuss the cultural movements of Republican motherhood and domesticity that likely did more than even physicians to restrain women's practices.
Oh, that's interesting. Would you tell us more about Republican motherhood and the cult of domesticity and how these ideas and movements restrained women's practice of medicine?
These are terms coined by historians, but they were real cultural movements. Republican motherhood, promoted by late 18th century reformers like Philadelphia's Dr. Benjamin Rush, argued that middle-class women should be educated to become intelligent, companionate wives and knowledgeable mothers who could train their sons to be loyal citizens of the young republic. But particularly in Philadelphia and among Quaker women, middle-class women argued that daughters also required an education, and this initiated the establishment of female academies. The Young Ladies' Academy of Philadelphia, founded in 1797, is an early example, and it provided instruction in public oratory, geography, chemistry, mathematics, and natural philosophy, science, as well as literature. And women used these newfound skills to pursue social reform and public health movements, including female education, women's rights, abolition, temperance, poor relief, public sanitation, and the betterment of prisons, asylums, and hospitals. This was this age of reform, and women were right there in the middle of it. So even though this was kind of a restrictive movement, women subverted Republican motherhood to their benefit. In terms of domesticity, this actually turned out to be an even more powerful discourse in women's advice literature. It sought to relegate women to the private household sphere, safe from the perils of the business domain that was considered the men's world. So there was this idealized creation of separate male and female spheres. And in general, working class whites and most women of color were not considered part of this middle class culture. They simply continued their healing work just as they did in the 18th century. But a Black middle class formed in Philadelphia, and African-American women like Sarah Bass had to juggle this idea of domesticity along with a push for respectability and social uplift that was part of an early strategy of Black equality, as well as doing public activism. Bass was hiding runaway slaves in her house and advocating abolition. So, although many women adhered to these precepts to confirm their place in the middle class, others ignored it. One example is a woman named Elizabeth Marshall, whose family pharmacy business founded by her grandfather went bankrupt in 1805 due to his mismanagement. So it was up to Elizabeth to restart the family business from the ground up. Within a decade, she reinvigorated and expanded the business and introduced industrial drug production. She worked with the prominent physician, Dr. Benjamin Smith Barton, to create a new medicine called Mistura glyceri composita in 1814 that was included in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the standard pharmaceuticals for the country. She supervised 12 apprentices who were recognized as the progressive pharmacists of Philadelphia. So we're actually seeing, for good or ill, the beginning of big pharma in Philadelphia, and women are there. In her own time in the Philadelphia community, people valued Marshall's pharmaceutical authority and her business accomplishments. But over the course of the 19th century, the achievements of women like Marshall were written out of histories of pharmacy and medicine. 20th century historians either omitted Marshall, they talk about her father and her grandfather, or reframed her as a self-effacing matron whose, here's a quote from one of these histories, her active yet unobtrusive duties of benevolence exemplified the chief ornaments of the Christian character. She was beneficent to all and kind and dispensed her charities with a liberal hand. So if you're thinking that sounds like Lady Bountiful, they're certainly alluding to Lady Bountiful, but they're throwing the mantle of a newly domesticized Lady Bountiful over Marshall's memory. So these historians erased a successful pharmaceutical and businesswoman, and her work really was forgotten. So one of the reasons we see this rounding of the 19th century and women are disappearing is partly because of historical amnesia.
We have a sense from our conversation that women like Gulielma Penn, Elizabeth Paschal, Sarah Bass, and Elizabeth Marshall all made really important contributions to the medical knowledge of early America, and especially to the early Philadelphia area. So, Susan, what do you think their historical influence has been on today's medical profession? What influence do you think the history of women healers in the early American period has had on the medical profession? You said we have a lot of historical amnesia. So do you see any lingering impact from these early female medical practitioners?
I think if we look back into history, along with recognizing Quaker women in the Philadelphia area as key leaders in the abolition and women's suffrage movements, I think it is important to acknowledge that Quaker women were also instrumental in creating the environment that nurtured the first women's degree-granting medical school in the U.S. and in the world, the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania. So this is a tremendous legacy. And the history of women physicians in the U.S. often begins with the college's 1850 founding. Dr. Ann Preston, one of the first graduates who also helped get this off the ground, would later offer encouragement in a speech to women medical students embarking on what she called a new and untried course of professional medical education. But as we've seen, this new and untried course was really just a more obvious signpost on a well-trodden path populated with all these medically skilled women that we've been talking about. Preston did note in her speech that women medical students were indebted to innumerable women who'd practiced as healers and apothecaries, as well as Quaker women ministers who'd pioneered spaces for women's authoritative presence in public. In terms of influence on current healthcare professionals, I just gave a book talk to the C.F. Reynolds Medical Society in Pittsburgh that included women medical students. And after the book talk, several asked, why don't we know this history about early Pennsylvania women healers and the first women's medical school? Why isn't it in books? Why isn't it in museums? They really don't know this history. And I think it shows how important things like this podcast are. We need to get these stories out to the public. Narratives of women healers of the past do speak to issues that reverberate into the 21st century and to today. The ongoing gender gap in science fields, particularly for women of color, reflects the long history of women's marginalization in disciplines that form the basis for healthcare jobs. And we keep asking the question, why are there so few women in science? But it begs an additional question for historians of science and medicine. Why are there so few historical role models of women in STEM and healthcare fields? Women's healing and scientific expertise have deep cultural roots, and girls and women can place themselves in a long historical narrative. So I think it's important to tell these stories that explain the struggles and successes of women healers of the past, because I think it provides readers and listeners with role models and strategies so that they can navigate contemporary cultural barriers to their practices.
And now it's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Susan, I know you listen to this podcast, so I know you've been waiting for this.
I am. This is my favorite part.
Well, here it is, your Time Warp question. In your opinion, what if wealthy women had not taken on the role of healers or Lady Bountifuls in their communities during the late 17th and early 18th centuries? How do you think early American communities would have fared without their medical treatment?
It's actually difficult to imagine an early America in which women were not providing health care. We would have lost their medical knowledge that they shared within their medical networks. Women like Anne Preston wouldn't have had the precedent of skilled women healers and elite women's engagement with science as they worked to create a women's medical school. And even beyond kind of the Lady Bountifuls, the elite white women, people also depended on the medical work of women of color and those of the lower social orders. So women healers, I think, were foundational for both the professionalization of medicine and for the persistence of a vibrant vernacular healing culture that continues into today. I think as a nurse, I also think about how women were important on a microhistory level where healing happens in interpersonal spaces. I think of Moravian women who came to the strange land of Pennsylvania from Europe, who were cared for by indigenous women during pregnancies and childbirth. And these were crisis periods in women's lives at the time, and how they provided cross-cultural support and exchange. I think of Margaret Hill Morris, another healer who provided supportive care for patients facing death. In one instance, this healer treated a Mr. Carey, whose consulting physician didn't explain that Carey's kidney failure was terminal. Morris, as his primary practitioner, was left with the difficult task of informing Mr. Carey that he was dying. And this is something that primary care practitioners also, often do have to do. And she offered him spiritual support. She said she reminded him of the comforts that await a weary traveler when the journey is at end. She was with him in his final hours, essentially providing what we would consider hospice care. So I think along with sort of the big trends, we have to think of innumerable people who would have lost the care and support of women healers.
Susan, now that you've written Women Healers, what other aspect of early American women's medical and health practices are you researching and writing about now?
My exploration of women's medical recipe manuscripts introduced me to a flourishing culture of patent medicines and self-help remedies. And I'm trying to figure out what patent medicines as material objects circulating around the Atlantic basin can tell us about the production and diffusion of medical knowledge and authority. The extent of patent medicines and this consumer self-help culture was surprising to me. Also, women as purveyors of these popular panaceas like Daffy's Elixir and Turlington's Balsam of Life helped to create a culture of medical consumerism in which health became a commodity that money could buy, something that we recognize today. And I find the deep roots of this culture interesting.
And for those of us who may be unfamiliar with the term patent medicine, would you tell us what that is?
Yes, these are also called proprietary medicines. These were medicines that were a secret recipe made by a family or a healer, and ultimately they were patented. Turlington's Balsam of Life that I mentioned was one of the first actual patents for a pharmaceutical in 1720. And I actually see women very much involved in intellectual property disputes. In Philadelphia, there's a woman named Elizabeth Weed who was an apothecary and has her husband's proprietary Weed's syrup. And she actually takes over the pharmacy business, and Weed syrup becomes so successful that people are stealing the recipe. So there's this crafty barber, James Kraft in New Jersey, who's pirating her medicines, and she actually enacts a lawsuit against him over her intellectual property rights. So it's just kind of a whole other aspect of healthcare that I find really interesting, and women are very much a part of it.
What is the best way for us to reach you if we have more questions about Women Healers?
I do have a website that's under construction, womenhealers.org, or my University of Colorado at Colorado Springs Department website.
Susan Bryant, thank you for sharing the lives and work of women healers in the early American period, and for telling us more about how medicine and healthcare worked in early America.
Thank you. I really enjoyed being a part of your program.
Women have always played a large role in American healthcare. In many ways, it's a tradition that predates European settlement in the Americas. Of course, in the European case, a lack of professionally trained physicians really did require that women treat the ailments of their families, servants, enslaved people, neighbors, and others within their colonial communities. As Susan related, the roles of early American women healers were varied. They performed many different types of roles, including apothecaries, bone setters, cancer specialists, herbalists, eye specialists, midwives, nurses, and even more roles than that. And women's knack and reputation for healing sometimes made them an even more trusted source for healthcare remedies and treatments than the relatively few professionally trained medical doctors who lived in early America. But it wasn't just the reputation of women healers that caused people to go to them. There was also the fact that women healers were often cheaper to see than formally trained physicians. As Susan noted, wealthy women might provide healthcare free of charge for those in their community, just like Gulielma Penn did, while other women healers from poorer and middling economic ranks might trade their medical care services for farm produce, a trade good, or perhaps even for some labor. One fact that I found very interesting is how Susan noted that professional doctors often had to behave around women and work with women healers because women healers sometimes performed cures like eye surgery better than they did, and because women seemed to be the arbiters of healthcare within their families. Mothers and other household matriarchs seemed to have been the people who actually decided when the work of a woman healer would do or when it was time to call a professionally trained doctor. And this interesting fact lays at the center of Susan's research. Today, many of us think of healthcare as a profession dominated by men and as a world where male physicians determine courses of treatment. In reality, this is a relatively modern idea. As Susan noted, it was only in the early 20th century that the United States introduced regulations and laws concerning healthcare and began to require professionally trained physicians and medical personnel to prescribe and administer medical treatment. Before this period, the work of women healers dominated. And if we look at the statistics, women healers still dominate in every area of U.S. healthcare except in the work of physicians and surgeons. So the tradition of women healers hasn't left us. It's still a very vital part of our healthcare system to this day. Look for more information about Susan, her book, Women Healers, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/379. Please help us better serve you with Ben Franklin's World. Please take our listener survey at benfranklinsworld.com/survey. That's benfranklinsworld.com/survey. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, Katie Schinnebeck, Ashley Bachnight, and Ian Tonat. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, is there something else that you'd like to learn about medicine and its practice in early America? Is there something else about the work of women that you'd like to know more about? Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.